Once again, social media's role in gun violence and mass shootings has come into question since the massacres in Buffalo, New York, and in Uvalde, Texas. A recent Daily Beast article argues that if states such as Florida or Texas took the First Amendment half as seriously as they do the Second, they would not be attacking the constitutional rights of social media sites to remove content that helps cause mass shootings.
The policy director at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard, said this talking point is wrong and argues that the Texas social media law allows platforms to remove content they already can remove under federal law, and that shooter videos could be removed as excessively violent under Section 230. The Texas law covers viewpoint discrimination only. A platform can still have policies against whole categories of content it bans, such as violent content or nudity, but cannot ban advocates of certain positions simply because of that advocacy. Joining us now to elaborate is Rachel Bovard, author of Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. Rachel, thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Yeah, so, okay, I want to get at this a little bit because I'm not sure I agree with you. If you're arguing, yes, they could take down the footage. If it was like live footage of a mass shooting, then sure, I see how that's excessively violent. But what about just, violent extremist content, like, for instance, the grocery shooters manifesto? I mean, I know that that's excessively violent. It's ideology. It's a horrible ideology, but it's ideology nonetheless, isn't it?
Well, I think it would depend on how they interpret incitement to violence, because incitement to violence is obviously already illegal, and so they could ban that content under existing federal law. There's nothing in the Texas law that prevents them from, what's already illegal, and also under Section 230, which incitement to violence is banned under that as well, they could remove that content. So the issue I have with the way this law is being framed is that it's constantly being put forward as content-based when it's actually just viewpoint-based. Platforms are still able to say entire categories of content are illegal. So the platform could come up with a definition of incitement to violence that they feel they say we're not going to host any content that meets these criteria, and it would still be legal. What they can't do is this sort of give and take where, this person's viewpoint is harassing, but this person discussing the same thing is not. That's what this law is trying to get at, to treat all comers equally. But you can still ban entire categories of content, as you can already do under existing law. And I would argue that shooter ideology, pushing toward violence because of X factor would potentially fall under that incitement to violence.
But under existing federal law, they can essentially do, and it has been interpreted that they can essentially do whatever they want, the existing federal law being Section 230, right, which allows for good faith moderation on a lot of. So if that's what we're defaulting to, isn't then the entire law just kind of preempted by federal law?
No, because the platforms have basically argued that Section 230 gives them the right to do whatever it is that they want, to have, to claim that they're not a publisher, but then also be a publisher at the same time in the sense of removing content. And this law seeks to say, no, it actually doesn't. It says, if you want to remove categories of content under that, are listed under Section 230 or are already illegal under federal law, you can do that. But you can't claim at one point to not be responsible for the content and then also be responsible for the content and claim an editorial right to remove it. It's essentially a common carriage requirement, right? It's saying all comers have to be treated equally.
No, right, I know, but what I'm saying is
categorical interpretation.
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying is right. Section 230, according to the view, is in the view of the social media companies and in the view of, the courts. Many of the courts that have weighed in, does in fact give that exact power that you just described. Right, that is what is the standard under Section 230. Now you can argue that it shouldn't be that way, but that's why I don't see how a state law comes in and says no, but that's just what has been established that Section 230 does. We don't have to, maybe we don't like it, we have to do something about Section 230 then.
Well, if your point is correct, that simply this is reiterative of Section 230, then I don't know why the platforms are making an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court to stop it. Because under your point, they already have the power to kind of do all of these things anyway. The platforms are claiming that, this punishes them as First Amendment actors. And the point that Texas has made repeatedly is look, in any other number of cases, these platforms have argued that they're not responsible for the content. In fact, in Texas state court, they've said, oh yeah, we know on Instagram that 14 and 15-year-olds are trafficked into sex slavery, but we're not responsible for that. And yet now they are claiming that, any attempt to curtail their right to remove content infringes on their First Amendment rights. So they're trying to be a publisher and not be a publisher at the same time. And Texas has pointed that out in their reply brief, because again, big tech has taken this all the way to the Supreme Court on the shadow docket.
It feels like the contrast of the Daily Beast article is trying to reveal is the way that people talk about First Amendment versus Second Amendment rights in kind of differently absolutist terms. So I think there's a greater understanding in a First Amendment context that it's not an unrestrained right, that whether we're talking about libel, slander, other kinds of infringements on rights, that we understand that there are some kinds of speech that are legally limited, copyright, et cetera. When we're talking in the gun context, there is a kind of absolutism that creeps in that is, I think, frustrating to people, especially when, as I listen to you you both going back and forth, it's obvious that in both contexts, we're using a constitutional hook to describe things which we as a society are basically deciding are objectionable on a case-by-case basis. Okay, society agrees that a platform shouldn't facilitate the trafficking of minors. Okay, but so why are we talking about that in these weird kind of constitutional terms? If we don't want people who are young or mentally unwell to be accessing guns and going on shooting sprees, that's something we can agree on. But there does seem to be a way in which framing it exclusively in terms of this constitutional rights-based framework takes away from the fact that we've all realized and decided as a society that there are limitations to these constitutionally circumscribed rights. And is that at bottom of what's going on here, both with the Section 230 discourse and the Second Amendment discourse, Rachel?
Well, I think as it relates to, the Texas law, that is sort of the argument that, the big tech platforms are making is the maximalist argument, right? That you cannot infringe at all upon our First Amendment rights. And we have a right to sort of take advantage of whatever, circumscribed speech operations we want on our own platform. But I think, the Texas law makes clear that, to your point about the First Amendment anyway, there's never been this maximalist approach in the law, particularly when it comes to things like common carriage. And I think more and more states are recognizing that while these platforms now do sort of shape the contours of what the public square looks like, there's never been this unabridged right to simply shut off, some people from the public square in a discriminatory fashion. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, look, there are limits here. And the platforms are free to impose content-based limits. But you cannot, as a matter of business, say, well, I don't like these people, so they can't come into the public square, but these people can. You have to have very clear rules of the road. And that's something that, businesses, since, we've been imposing common carriage since the 1300s. So there is, I think a recognition, at least in this debate, that there's never been this sort of maximalist view for businesses that have an interest in the public square and public discourse. And that's the threshold that we're crossing, I think, with big tech. We're going from these platforms being just exclusively viewed as, private businesses making decisions to no, now they have a social interest in a public good. And when it comes to First Amendment rights in that context, there's always been a little bit of abridgment in that case.
Well, but in the social media case, go ahead, Bree.
Well, it's just that the public carriage point, we were historically talking about being able to pick up a phone and make a call privately. We're talking about platforms that weren't public facing in a way that we have now. And it seems to me that all of these public facing platforms are necessarily by design also publishers, right? And that's what makes it difficult. If we can't have a laissez-faire status the way we did with a phone call, because there's not a sense that if I call my friend and say a bunch of violent, horrible things to her, that has the kind of broad public dissemination effect that a platform like a Facebook or a Twitter or something like that has. And if we kind of just accept that reality, that there is going to have to be some form of moderation, to me that's the point, that we're talking about these very subjective lines of moderation. You brought up the Shooter Manifesto and drawing a line between that and the live stream of the attack, but I'm not sure that line is as clear as we would like it to be. And I can see people drawing a line that says neither of those is allowed, both of those are allowed, or one of them is allowed. And fundamentally, it's a conversation, a substantive conversation about the quality of the material, not about the kind of architecture of the site or these broader principles.
Well, I agree, and I would say that there is going to be moderation. The question of whose moderation, where's the line drawn, and I would say that despite a lot of their bad moderation policies, I would still rather have that decision left to the platform than to governments or legislators who have no idea what they're talking about.
So the way in which this law would be enforced, so the platforms have claimed, that it's an emergency because they're going to be subject to all these penalties. No, in this case, basically the law lays down the rules of the road and says, look, you have to have this, you can't do viewpoint, you can do content-based moderation. That is then enforced via the courts. There's no penalty imposed for noncompliance. The only penalty imposed is after a trial, after potentially a jury has made these choices. So I think to the point Bree is making, we're taking some of these very difficult decisions, and I don't want to make light of them. I mean, these are not clear-cut questions. We're taking very difficult decisions and we're putting them back into the hands of the people more than they already are, because I think to Robbie's point, right now they're exclusively controlled by these platforms. I also have concerns with the government making content moderation decisions. And what's interesting about this law is if it were to go forward, that's kind of the discovery that I'm interested in. If this law is allowed to progress, I do want to get access to and see how many times these social media companies are cooperating with the government in terms of what their content moderation policies are. But I think the last point I'll make here, again, sort of agreeing with Bree a little bit, is that these are not easy questions. And all of the big tech platforms have pushed this to the Supreme Court and said, well, this is a slam dunk case. This is obviously a violation of our First Amendment rights. It's been weeks now. And the Supreme Court, despite this being on the emergency docket, hasn't responded. And I think that's because, again, these are difficult, nuanced questions. I suspect at least one of the justices is writing something. I don't know how it's going to come down, but these are not easy questions. And I think that's where we are right now as a country, recognizing the social interests these platforms have and trying to figure out the best way to sort of maximize input for how we move forward with the role these companies now play.
Well, thanks for helping us try to moot this today, Rachel.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
We'll have more rising after this.